Hey folks, welcome back. Today's episode is about the billions of organisms that we coexist with in our bodies and on our bodies. And of course, I'm referring to your microbiome. My guest today is Kiran Krishnan, who the man is a total expert in this field. He is, among many other things, also one of the co-founders and the chief scientific officer for Microbiome Labs, which makes amazing, amazing products, not just probiotics, but prebiotics as well, and a number of other products for this space. Microbiome Labs is constantly innovating. They've got new tests these days. They're looking at different microbiomes in the human body. You basically have a microbiome in every orifice of your body that you can think of. So anyway, he is currently involved in 16 novel human clinical trials on probiotics and the microbiome. So this is how we know a true expert, right? A true expert is someone who doesn't only know what he's talking about today, but is constantly learning and moving the space forward. And the thing about the microbiome, just like so much of human health, is there's a lot we know, but there is so much more that we don't know. So we're always learning. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I enjoyed recording it. If you want to learn more about Microbiome Labs, you can simply go to microbiomelabs.com. And we didn't have a discount code for the listeners when we recorded this, but there should be one in the show notes by the time the podcast is published. So make sure you check the show notes for that. You know how much I appreciate you guys, how much I love hearing from you in the comments, questions. You can submit them through my website, natniddam.com, or you can reach out to me on Instagram, natalieniddam.com. And last but not least, we can connect in person pretty much if you are interested in joining my new community called BSP Community. So it's B like biohacking, S like superhuman, P like performance. On Mighty Networks, and you can learn all about the community through my website on natniddam.com. There's a whole page there about it that'll tell you all about what's involved in joining. Hey folks, just a quick reminder that all of the information presented in this podcast is for information purposes only. No medical advice, no diagnosing, no treatments suggested here. Before you try anything that you hear about or learn about here, make sure that you check with your medical provider. Welcome to the podcast, Kiran Krishnan. It is such a pleasure to have you here today.
It is my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, I'm super excited. Who was it that introduced us? It was Dasha Maximov. She's like my connector.
Yeah,
I do retreats. I did a retreat with her in March, a women's retreat, and she's just one of these people that is just like, she's like 6 degrees of separation person.
She is very extroverted, or maybe introverted, but just knows how to adapt to it, and everybody knows her. Yeah, she just goes out and connects.
Yeah, no, she's amazing.
Awesome.
Yeah. Anyway, so I'm very grateful to her for this because you are one of those people that I've always dreamed of having on the podcast. So I'm really excited to be here today. So we don't have a lot of time, guys. So for the listeners, this won't be the marathon podcast. However, there'll be a part 2 at some point. Yes. And what we were talking about, what we were going to talk about, because there's so many things we can talk about here. But I think what we're going to start with is the microbiome, talking about this concept of a microbiome cloud. And then we'll kind of hone in from there. And then we might just get into a couple of other topics. But the idea of the microbiome cloud, which is not something that I've had that much exposure to, I think is just really interesting. And I think would be interesting for people to get their heads around.
Yeah. Well, and before I dig into that specific topic, I think it's important for people to understand just the basics around, your microbiome is obviously all of the microbes that live in and on you, right?
Yeah.
And a very important part of it is also their genetic material.
Mm-hmm.
And that part is critical because we have 150 times more microbial DNA in our system than human DNA. Right. Yeah. And if we were to count on just our DNA to live, we wouldn't even exist because we are wholly inadequate when it comes to our genomic capabilities. We have around 22,000 functional genes in our genomes, and compare that to like an earthworm that has 30,000 functional genes, right? So
Hilarious.
they're not that sophisticated, right?
No, we're the simpletons, really.
We're the very, very simpletons in the animal kingdom, but the reason why we're at the top of the food chain, top of the evolutionary ladder, is a couple things. One is the development of the brain, right? And the ability of having the brain to body size ratio that we tend to have. But then the brain wouldn't exist and all the other biological systems wouldn't exist if we didn't have a large fermentive base in our colon. So one of the things that mammals did, or accidentally did, I don't want it to sound like we did it on purpose, but we accidentally did that, where we adopted a large fermentive base of microbes in our digestive tracts. And this is true for all kinds of mammals, right? Ruminants and our closest ape friends and all that. So having that large fermentive base means that you've got a biochemical nutrient factory in your system that provides for you lots and lots of capabilities that we normally wouldn't have. And these are capabilities to produce things that we need, that our cells need, right? And these are the capabilities of breaking down things and assimilating things and utilizing nutrients properly, all of which we don't have the DNA capacity to do. We count on the microbes in our system to do it, right? At any given time in your blood, there are thousands of chemicals floating around. And when I say chemicals, I mean, it's our own biological chemicals, not outside chemicals, right? Our own chemistries floating around that are incredibly important for our basic function. More than half of all of those compounds were made in the gut by microbes. And these are compounds we cannot get from diet and we cannot make ourselves.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So that's why it's so important. Now, a big part of how this large fermentive base came about, and a big part of how we continue to try to build on it, is the interaction between us with other people, and then interaction with us in the environment, and interaction with us and other species, even, right? So all of these species share and interchange microbes all the time. That's how we were designed. We all kind of evolved in the same, ecosystem and picked up different types of organisms that harbor our systems, but we're constantly exchanging those organisms between us, the environment, other animals, and between other humans, and so on, right? So we have to think of it that human existence is there today because we were in constant osmosis with the world around us when it comes to microbes, right? So it's nothing new to share microbes. So as it turns out, even within households, even within offices where people frequent and all that, you start creating an ecosystem that's a microbiome cloud, where the individuals within that system share microbes together. Now, this is in general a good thing. However, it can also be a bad thing if one or more of those individuals who are participants in the microbiome cloud are actually disrupting the cloud by putting out dysbiotic bacteria. So there was a really fascinating study out of Johns Hopkins that looked at individuals who were given a prescription of antibiotics, right? And they took samples of their microbiome prior to starting the antibiotics. Then they took samples during the course of the antibiotics. And then they took samples up to 6 months after the antibiotic course was done. And without surprise, as you can imagine, they found that there was a significant dysbiosis that was created during the course of antibiotics. And then that dysbiosis could also be measured upwards of 6 months after stopping the course, right?
No kidding.
Now, here's the surprising thing from the study. They also measured the microbiome of individuals that lived in the same household as the person taking the antibiotics, but those household mates were not on antibiotics, and yet they found similar disruptions in their microbiomes as well.
You're kidding. So their microbiomes were disrupted by the people taking the antibiotics versus their microbiomes helping the person on antibiotics rebalance.
Now, over time, presumably, once the antibiotics are so powerful that they're going to outweigh any sort of positive sharing from the other people, right? And in fact, the change is profound enough where the antibiotic effect is actually seen in the other individuals. Now, presumably, if people in the household are making the right decisions, over time, the microbiomes will go back to being normal or their version of normal or healthy
Right.
again, right?
Right.
But again, they'd have to be doing something more actively to do that, because there are studies that show that even a single course of clindamycin for 7 days, you can see the disruption in the microbiome up to 2 years after.
Wow. So,
So if you're
wow.
not actively trying to improve it,
So,
it may just stay disrupted forever.
well, yeah, well, that's sending me down a rabbit hole. We're not going to go there. We don't have time today. But so just quickly, because we don't have a long time to talk today, so I'm going to interject with a couple of questions of action points that people, because that's a bomb. So what's a person to do? What are the right things? Are there, I guess I've always wondered if, depending on the antibiotic, are there different probiotics a person should be taking before, during, and maybe during and after an antibiotic course, or are there general guidelines to which probiotics a person would take to reestablish or to help their body, let's call it help their body come back into balance sooner after an antibiotic course?
Yeah. So when it comes to the microbiome, most antibiotics work very similarly. Because what happens is most antibiotics stay in the gut for around 2.5 to 3 hours, right? And then they get metabolized and they enter into circulation. Now, when they're in circulation, they don't impact the gut as much. It's that 2.5 to 3 hour period while they're in the gut that they're really disrupting things. Now, some antibiotics are better at killing anaerobes, some are better at killing aerobes. But the thing is, your gut has both, right? Yeah. So it's going to disrupt most things. And in fact, there was a study out of Princeton University that looked at the impact on the microbiome with a whole number of classes of antibiotics. And they basically found that within the first hour or so of the antibiotic being in the system, it knocked down all microbes down by 98%. Wow. Right? So everything got wiped out. Now the microbes start to grow back, but they grow back in a dysbiotic proportion, right? And that's where you really start to see problems. So all antibiotics will work very similarly in the gut in terms of how they disrupt. Now, what you do about them is also pretty much the same. Spore-based probiotics have been used for many, many decades to work against disruption of the gut by antibiotics. We've done and published a couple studies on that already. So spore-based probiotics help in a couple different ways. One, because they will outcompete any dysbiotic bacteria that are regrowing too fast. Yeah. They also produce compounds to help regrow the beneficial bacteria. They acidify the gut, because one of the things that occurs when you take antibiotics is, imagine your gut has this acidic nature to it, right? Which is better and healthier for the gut in general. Most of the beneficial bacteria do well in an acid environment. Most of the bad bacteria and fungus and all that do better in a more basic environment, less acid. And so what happens is, imagine you take a course of antibiotics and all your acid producing bacteria get knocked down. Now you're not producing acid enough. Now the pH of the gut changes. That actually favors the faster regrowth of dysfunctional bacteria. So being able to get a bacteria in there, even in that harsh environment, be able to produce enough acid, then it helps the good bacteria come back and suppress the bad bacteria. Right. That's another thing that the spores do. They produce lactic acid in the gut that helps bring back the other microbes. They also compete against pathogens. They're it's called competitive exclusion. They're very strong at doing that. So if pathogens are starting to rear their ugly head and grow, they'll bring those levels down. And then, most importantly, I would say, is they seal up the gut lining. Because one of the consequences of taking antibiotics is the microbes that manage the lining of the gut and the structures within the lining of the gut, they get knocked down. So the lining of the gut becomes severely inflamed, which then opens up tight junctions in between the cells. So inevitably, you'll end up with leaky gut from it, right? So being able to seal that back up and rebuild that lining becomes really important. Right. So we use the spore-based probiotics. We use the Megaspore. And then we also, in the retail space, it just Thrive, but the Megaspore is the practitioner grade product. I've used that. Use a prebiotic, which is also really important, because you want a prebiotic that is specific to these keystone organisms. And keystone organisms are these really important organisms in the gut microbiome that manage and build and support the rest of the microbial structures, right? So these are organisms like Faecalibacter prausnitzii and Bifidobacterium longum and Akkermansia muciniphila, right? So these are really important organisms that are directly associated with health. When they are low, then everything falls apart. So using the right type of oligosaccharide prebiotics to regrow those organisms becomes a critical part of recovery from the antibiotic. Now, the other thing that the antibiotic study showed us is that, yes, this was using antibiotics, which is a pretty profound effect on the microbiome, but the same thing occurs over time if people within the household have dysbiotic guts, right? So if you live in a household, for example, and I always bring up the example of moms, if they're working with their kids and they're really honed in on their kids' health and nutrition and not taking care of themselves as well, then their dysbiosis is going to impact their kid, right? And the same thing with the family member. If you've got a mom that's very health conscious and working on her kids, and the dad who doesn't care and he's just eating whatever, drinking, smoking, doesn't care, he is impacting the microbiome of everyone else in the home very significantly, especially over time. So it becomes really important to think of your household as a health community, right? Some people have different habits than others, right? Different behaviors and lifestyle choices. But if at least you can get everyone on a probiotic, a prebiotic, making a couple of food decisions that are good for them, a couple of small lifestyle decisions that are good for them, it becomes better for everybody in the household. And if you're a practitioner listening to this, it becomes really important that you're treating the patient's household as well, other individuals within the household, as much as it becomes important to treat your patient, right? So if you're working with a client who's dealing with anxiety, mood, stress disorders, autoimmune, whatever it may be, you have to also see if you can encourage them to have other people in their household making smarter decisions as well, right? That's going to help your patient significantly. So that's the main important thing of all of this.
So what about households where, and I'm asking this because I have someone in my life right now who's dealing with this, who has the 2-year-old who started daycare and who is like, they go through that nightmare year of being just a hot mess. Like these kids,
every week,
they suffer and the parents go with them. Like they all, the whole ship goes down kind of thing. Do you aggressively treat 2-year-olds with probiotics as well, just in smaller amounts, or how do you?
We do. In fact, after the age of 1, basically, and certainly at 2, they have very adult-like microbiomes. So you can absolutely use adult doses of the right type of probiotic, right? We use the Megaspore with kids from 3-4 months old onwards. Wow. And they do perfectly well with it. Now, what really is interesting about the kids aspect of it, and you've probably heard this before, one of the best things you can do with a 2-year-old with using probiotics and all that is also making them play in the dirt.
Sure.
And that has a huge impact, right? In fact, there's a study on this that's really interesting. There's something called the Finnish allergy study. It's a big national allergy study that was run by the country of Finland, right? And the reason they ran it is because they're seeing an epidemic of kids with allergies, asthma, high levels of viral infection and all that, especially running through schools and so on. And then there's a town in Russia that is something like 100 kilometers away from Finland, basically the same geography, but they have far lower rates of allergies, asthma, and all that. So they put on a big study to figure out what are the differences between the two and why is one so high and the other so low. And they basically realized that in Finland, they're over sterilizing their environments, right? So they're sterilizing, they're cleaning all of the surfaces with antimicrobial. They, like many of us in the modern world, are programmed to think that spick and span clean, sterile smell is clean. Right? And it's actually not, right?
Yeah.
It's
Bleach everywhere.
Exactly. Bleach everywhere with the fake lemon smell, right? That's our world of clean, but it's not. And so in the town in Russia, they don't do that. They don't clean the surfaces that way. And they have doors and windows open a lot more. So they have more outside microbes coming in. Remember, I talked about early on, we have to be more in osmosis with the outside environment. So in Finland, it's all closed, it's air conditioning, it's internal circulatory air, and then everything's being sterilized. So then they took it one step further. They said, okay, how about in daycares, we take a certain number of daycares and preschools, and we create these dirt piles. And then we make it so that the kids X number of times a week have to play in the dirt pile as part of their curriculum.
Yeah.
So they've been doing this. And what they find is that in the schools where they have kids playing in the dirt pile, the rates of allergies, asthma, and viral infections are going down.
Wow.
And then the ones where they don't, they continue to go up. Right. So that is one of the most powerful things you can do with a 2-year-old. Another great study around little kids, simple study when you think about it, a group of researchers followed moms who had one of two behaviors. When the kids had pacifiers, right, and the baby would drop the pacifier on the ground. They followed groups of moms that would either take the pacifier, clean it with their own mouth and put it back in the baby, or moms who would take it, sterilize it with wipes and all that, and then put it back in the baby's mouth. They followed them over a number of years, and they found that the moms that cleaned it with their own mouth had babies with much lower incidence rate of allergies.
Really?
Right? So it makes a difference, right? So keep in mind that, and this is why I started our discussion with explaining the importance of that osmosis. The more and more we bar ourselves from microbial exposure, and the more we sterilize things around us, the more and more sick we become.
Yeah, that's so fascinating because, there's all this and it's finding that line, right? Because you've got so many people have issues in their homes, let's say with mold, like so you could talk about the home biome is disrupted, right? Because mold is like it's almost like an opportunistic pathogen in our gut, but it's in the home. And so in that sense, you can be neurotic about getting rid of the mold and doing whatever it takes. Right. But
absolutely. It's the same as if you had, for example, an infection of Staph aureus in your home, right?
Yeah.
Where lots of people are getting staph infection or MRSA infections. You have to go through and sterilize all the showers and, get rid of all the towels and get new ones and all of those things, all the contact surfaces. But that's like having an infection in your body. You have to get rid of it, right?
Yeah.
So absolutely. I think in those cases, you want to do what you can to control the pathogens or the opportunistic organisms. But for most people, most of the time, we want more microbes and we want to have more engagement with microbes. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, part of this is also just the cleaners and the products that we use in our homes have so much to do with it. Like we were talking about that lemon fresh bleachy scent. I mean, personally, it makes me feel ill at this point. Like I've so left this stuff behind, or, the detergents that you use on your clothes and stuff like that. And people don't even think about, never mind, like there's the whole endocrine disruption aspect, but these products also very much, I think, disrupt our microbiomes, both surface, like skin, and all the other orifices that we have.
Absolutely, they do, and that's a very important step in people trying to improve the health of their gut, their immune system, their metabolic system, is starting with what do we have around us, right? So we went through an exercise almost a decade ago where we looked at all the household cleaners we had in our home, and we said, okay, what all can we eliminate and not have to have, right? So you do need some sort of sterilization mechanism should you get a contamination in your home. For example, we bring home a raw chicken. You get raw chicken juice on your counter, you're going to want to kill the salmonella that's on there. So you need some sort of bleach wipe or something for that kind of incident. But for the vast majority of the surfaces in your home, including things like your desk and your countertops and all that, for the most part, you don't need to sterilize them. We clean most of our house with just water, a spray of water with a couple drops of essential oil mostly for smell, and wipe it down with a rag, right? And that's the extent. Now, the same thing on personal care products.
Yes.
Right? Most of what we put on ourselves, our lotions, deodorants, toothpaste, all of those things contain antimicrobials and antifungals and all of these small molecules that disrupt our ecosystem. And so one of my biggest recommendations to people is, take one product at a time and try to work and find the cleanest version of the product, right? It's a little overwhelming to kind of make make away with your entire medicine cabinet of things and everything in your shower and so on. So I started personally with deodorant and shampoo, basically, right? And I was like, okay, I'm going to work and try many different brands and find the cleanest version that works for my biology, right? And then once I figured out the right deodorant and the right shampoo, then I went on to the right lotion. I use a lot of lotion because my skin gets dry. So I want the healthiest, cleanest, best lotion. So I went through an exercise to try that. So as you do that, each of those things will significantly add up to outcomes that are positive, right? So these are simple things that people can do to start making some baby steps.
For sure. And I mean, not to dwell on this too much, but even in the essential oil world, sometimes people forget that there's some essential oils that are pretty powerful antimicrobials, and they can turn against you, like your oil of oregano's, your neem, like they're great oils. But they have to be treated with as much respect almost as a bleach, because they can wipe things out pretty darn fast.
They can. They're extremely powerful. I mean, the spores that we work with are pretty robust, and they can withstand a lot of things. But one of the things that they don't stand well is certain types of essential oils.
Interesting.
The essential oils will even destroy the spores.
Wow.
So yeah, those are powerful things. Typically, we try to use like a citrus-ish oil that provides more of a volatile smell more than anything.
Yeah.
But yeah, many of those essential oils are very powerful.
Okay. Cool. So we've talked about the home biome, kind of talked about the microbiome. I mean, I do think it is, when we were talking before the podcast, talking about, how your toothbrush is impacted. And I was very proud of myself. I said, well, my toothbrush lives in my bathroom. Nobody else uses my bathroom. And you started laughing at me. You're no, not so much.
Common misconception. Yeah. So here's one of the things when I described that study, that antibiotic study, right? A lot of times people ask me, well, how did that happen? Like, how did one person take an antibiotic impact microbiomes of others? Like, were they oozing antibiotics that affected other people or what? And it's not that, right? So the antibiotics, again, like I mentioned, gets metabolized within a couple of hours, enters into circulation, and then eventually those people, their liver captures whatever's left and then sends it out. So it's not the antibiotic oozing out. What happens is when you're on antibiotics and your microbiome is disrupted, you start shedding lots of dysbiotic bacteria through your stool and even off your skin, right? So the microbes on your skin are also determined by what's happening in your gut mucosa, which then translates to your skin mucosa, which is just under the top layer of the skin. So your microbes in your gut and your skin start to shift, and you may start getting much higher levels of certain types of enteric bacteria like Klebsiella or E. coli and other types of microbes that can be problematic and dysbiotic because they're growing back faster. They seem to do better in that antibiotic presence and so on. So now think about, you're starting to build higher levels of those organisms, and you're starting to shed them as well through defecation and off your skin. So defecation, how do other people end up with your poop, right? So,
the question many people want to know.
People want to know. These are important things that people need to keep in the back of their mind. You go poop in the toilet, right? And the moment your stool hits the water, it's going to dislodge a lot of bacteria from the surface of the stool itself. Now all these microbes are sitting on the surface of the water, right? Then when you flush your toilet, and then there's that vortex as it's spinning, that causes an aerosolization of those microbes up into the air. That aerosol is going to be picked up by your air vent system, goes through your HVAC system and blows back out to everybody else, right? So you can find your fecal microbes floating around in the air and settling on all the surfaces, including other people's toothbrushes that are in other bathrooms, right? So then you pick up your toothbrush in the morning and you're brushing it, you're picking up microbes from the person living in the same household as you. Their stool microbes are on your toothbrush.
Yeah, brushing my teeth is never going to really be the same after this.
No, exactly.
Although we don't have, I live in an old house with rats, so maybe it's not as bad in my house.
That's true. Well, and then the other way, with your skin, if you look at, if you don't dust your home for a couple of days, right?
Yeah.
You see this layer of dust on everything. 95% of dust is human skin cells.
Really?
Right? Yeah, it's human skin cells, right? That's what you're seeing settling down on everything.
Yeah.
95% of that solid matter is human skin cells. And for every one human skin cell, there's 35 microbes on the skin cell. Right.
Oh,
So
you're killing me.
when you see dust, what you can see as dust, there's 35 times that as microbes from
Right.
other people. Right. So then if those people's skin is dysbiotic and they're shedding out more Staph aureus, for example, because they're on antibiotics, then you've got much more Staph aureus settling on everything, including your food, right? If your food's sitting there.
So then so really when somebody in the household is doing a course of antibiotics, you essentially want the whole household to do a course of spore biotics.
Exactly. And
at the end of the day, everybody's going to have to do. And would you say it's like a 2-week or a 30-day course? Or and what are your thoughts on? I'm going to fast fire a couple questions because we're running out of time and it's making me crazy. But so let's say after a course of antibiotics, and it just so happens in my house, there's 2 people on antibiotics right now, which happens never, but it just so happens for 2 completely different reasons. So would everybody be well advised to do a 30-day run then do you think people should do probiotics all the time? And if yes, then should I do all the same probiotic or should people be cycling through probiotics?
Yeah, those are really great questions. People have those questions all the time. So with the antibiotics, we recommend at the least 3 times longer than the course of the antibiotic, right? So if you're taking the megaspore, for example, if your course of antibiotics are for 7 days, 21 days minimum, the megaspore, but might as well finish out the bottle, which is a 30-day bottle, and do a bottle for everybody.
For sure. Yeah.
So that becomes an important thing when you think about antibiotics. Now, should people be on antibiotics every day, probiotics every day? We thought about this question a lot 10, 12 years ago, because when you start looking at all the probiotics out there, we're trying to figure out, what is the rationale between how all of these are developed? Yeah. Does any of it mimic what naturally happens, in the environment? And I would say, depending on the probiotic, then yes, absolutely, because remember, I mentioned earlier about this being in constant osmosis with the world around you, right? Mm-hmm. And so normally what's supposed to happen and what's happened for 99.999% of human existence, we were constantly in osmosis with the outside environment, where we gained exposure to organisms from the outside. And at the same time, we put organisms back to the outside, right? And many of those organisms that we gained exposure to from the outside actually function as probiotics. Right? Most of them don't, but some of them do. When I distinguish whether they function as probiotics or not, what I mean is, do they meet the scientific definition of a probiotic, which is a live microorganism when administered in adequate amounts confers a health benefit to the host, right?
Right. And colonizes.
Colonizes, even if it's for a short amount of time, they get to survive through. Mm-hmm. And they get to make it past all of the gauntlets that are designed to stop bacteria from making it through, starting with your mouth, your alpha amylase and your IgA in your mouth. And then, of course, in the stomach, the acid wash or the gastric barrier, as we call it. And then once it gets past the stomach, there's bile acids and pancreatic enzymes, all of which can kill microbes as well. So all of that is designed to protect you from, bad microbes making their way through and inoculating your gut all the time with bad microbes. However, there are some microbes that have been designed by nature to make it through this crazy gauntlet and actually enter the intestines alive.
Yeah.
Right? So that meets the first very important definition, because if nature has somehow designed this microbe to survive through some of the worst, harshest environments for microbes to survive through, there may be some intent behind that, right? Some evolutionary significance behind that. And so then that's how we kind of honed in on the bacterial spores, because when you look at the outside environment, most of the microbes in the outside environment won't survive through, but the bacterial spores do. And when they do survive through, then we looked at what do they do in the system. And it's pretty clear that we've outsourced a number of critical functions that we need to happen every day. We've outsourced it to these organisms, right? In particular, some of the functions I talked about earlier that competition of pathogens, the ability to read the microbial environment, which is something called quorum sensing, and then find pathogenic organisms and sit next to them and start competing with them to bring their levels down, right? They also seal up the gut. So they upregulate the tight junction proteins and they seal up the gut lining. They also increase the growth of lots of other beneficial bacteria, and then they start rebuilding that mucosal layer as well. They also train the immune system, right? So they help train the immune system in that they can upregulate something called a Treg system, which is the part of the immune system that dampens unfavorable immune responses, like allergies and sensitivities, right? But then they also upregulate the formation of B cells and T cells to be able to deal with things like incoming pathogens and viruses and so on, right? So all of these important functions, many of which we cannot do for ourselves, we've outsourced to these outside microbes, and we formed a symbiotic relationship with them, or a mutualistic relationship, where we say, hey, we'll give you a home. You can live here. Our immune system will tolerate you. But at the same time, you have to clean up the home and fix all these things, right? So when we looked at that, we go, okay, then for most of human evolution, humans gain daily exposure to these organisms just from being in the environment, right? Drinking water from rivers and streams and eating off the land and eating dirt and all that. But in our modern world, we have divorced ourselves from exposure to these organisms. So what is the impact of that? Right. And we start to see the impact of that because we're missing those functions. So to us, if you're talking about a probiotic like that, one that the spore-based probiotics, like the megaspore in particular, where we've captured microorganisms that naturally do all these things that we're supposed to get exposed to in the outside world, we've brought them back into the system so you can gain a level of exposure to them on a daily basis, right? Because we're not doing that naturally. So those types of probiotics you really need daily exposure to, because it helps make up for the fact that we live in these relatively sterile worlds away from the environment now. Right. Lots of the other random kitchen sink things that are out there where companies just throw 15, 20, 25 strains together and some random doses of 50 billion, 30 billion, there's no scientific sense to any of those kind of formulas. Those are just kind of what I call kitchen sink formulas, and so there's no rationale for taking those kind of things on a daily basis.
And I think a bit of what you're saying also speaks to that whole idea of getting out in nature, which we talk about a lot in the biohacking, ironically in this biohacking world where, we're talking about health tech and supplements and this and that. And, when we stop talking about that stuff long enough, expose yourself to natural light and get the hell out in nature so that to a large degree, I think a lot of what you're talking about gets covered off there. It's exposure to this biome of nature, all of these bacteria and organisms that your body needs to function properly.
Yeah, and we need to be prescriptive about it. And that's one of the recommendations I always make to people about improving their health is, write yourself a prescription if you have to for 3 times a week, 30 minutes a day of being somewhere in a natural environment. Right? Whether it's going for a walk in the forest preserves, like we have a lot of forest preserves by us, or if you're on the coast going to the beach and the dunes and places like that. So just think about undisturbed kind of natural environments, not like your sidewalk that you're walking on, from between your school and your home and things like that. It's a little bit better than not being outside, but it's not quite the same. I also tell people to take one step further. This is how you can enhance or enrich any of those experiences, right? So bring a snack with you. For example, the best thing is like a sandwich. If you eat sandwiches, some people don't eat sandwiches. Right?
You just stepped on a minefield there.
Exactly. Or a wrap or a snack.
Whatever. Bring some food.
Finger food, right? Something you eat with your hands is the key. And then while you're going for your little walk in nature in the first 10, 15 minutes, touch a lot of things, right? Touch trees, touch rocks, touch leaves, and do all of that stuff. And then when you sit down, you take a moment, you sit down and you eat within nature. And without washing and cleaning your hands and wiping it off, grab your food and feed yourself with it. That mimics the closest thing we can to what our ancestors did for millions of years that helped them harbor and bring about a relationship with outside environmental bacteria, which has a huge positive impact on your health. Now, you could just quickly ride your bike through a trail still good, but not as good. You can quickly walk through or jog through a trail, still good, but not as good. If you take a little bit of time and you sit down and you eat, you consume, you get those organisms inside you, that's where you really start to see the benefit.
Interesting. Yeah, well, I would think foraging wouldn't be bad too, like picking berries or whatever off a bush.
Totally.
Okay, so before we have to go, how many minutes do we have left? I just want to do a time check.
At least like 15 minutes.
Oh, okay, 15 minutes.
Yeah.
15 minutes is good. All right, so we've talked about this, that post antibiotics. Maybe we could talk a little bit about. There's so many things I want to talk to you about. Why don't we? I know you've been talking a lot lately about the gut-brain access and how your microbiome affect. And we know that the microbiome, like there's been a lot of noise about this, about the link between microbiome health, mental health, neurodegenerative diseases, like, this two-way communication that's constantly going on.
Yeah.
And so maybe we could talk about this and then when we talked about it earlier, you said anxiety and mood in light of the last 2 years we've went through, and that there was something interesting that we learned from COVID also around the microbiome. So I'm setting the stage, and guys, I'm not asking as many questions as this episode because I just want to let Kiran talk.
Yeah. And again, I'll promise that we'll come back and do a part 2 to give him even more info, but let's talk about the gut-brain axis for a moment, because that's so important. And one of the things I always, and I've been lecturing on this a lot, as you mentioned, and my lectures I lecture in a variety of different places, right? So I lecture in very scientific type of events like university, research events, to medical conferences, all the way to biohacking shows where it's just, intelligent consumers that are very health conscious. But one of the most important things that I always make sure to say in the beginning when I'm talking about the gut-brain axis is that we always talk about how the gut and the brain is connected and they work with each other and support one another. But what we really don't highlight enough is how a dysfunctional gut arguably becomes the most toxic thing to your brain, right? And that's the thing people really need to understand, because our guts and our brain kind of function enough for us to get by, right? Mm-hmm. And even if your gut is messed up, your brain is functioning still. And so you may not realize that if your gut is messed up or dysbiotic in any way, it's becoming the most toxic thing to your brain, meaning it's slowly, literally eating away at your brain, right? And we'll explain how that happens. So there's
right up there with my poopy toothbrush.
Exactly. The fact that your brain is currently being eaten and your toothbrush is full of poop, between all the
those are takeaways.
To continue your day after this. So here's the thing about it, which is so fascinating when you really look at it, is a dysfunctional gut is toxic, super toxic to your brain. A healthy functional gut is the most beneficial protective thing for your brain, right? So everyone is somewhere on that spectrum. Yeah. They're either way towards the end where their brain is being eaten away by a dysfunctional gut, or they have a very healthy gut and they've got super protective brain and will be fine for decades on end. The way this happens is that there's really two aspects to a dysfunctional gut that damages your brain, and the symptoms of it are both acute and chronic and long term as well, right? So the other realization I try to give people, which really shocks a lot of people, is if you're experiencing anxiety right now, if you're experiencing significant amount of stress, if you're experiencing sleeplessness, right? These are all pretty common symptoms that we all experience. What is crazy to think about is that those symptoms that you're experiencing are essentially pre-Alzheimer's, pre-Parkinson's type of symptoms, right? So because the pathologies that create anxiety in your brain and your body are the exact pathologies that eventually create Alzheimer's. Right?
Tremendous.
There's no difference. There's no difference there, right?
Super happy I'm a good sleeper. Yes, keep going.
Exactly. And so if you think about the myriad of people running around right now, most of the people listening to this, thinking about all the anxiety they experience throughout the day, those are all early Alzheimer's signals and dementia signals, right? So we need to be able to curb those problems early on. So what's happening in your body when you're experiencing anxiety, and then how does that lead to long-term degenerative conditions? So this, as I mentioned, there's two pathologies. One is leaky gut, right? So leaky gut allows for the translocation or the movement of something called LPS endotoxins, right, across your gut membrane. So it moves past the lining of the gut into circulation. And when it gets into circulation, one of the places it goes is to the brain. And when LPS enters the brain, it triggers an inflammatory response in the brain where innate immune actors like microglia cells make it to that region and start creating inflammation in that area, which eventually kills the brain tissue. Right. So that's the eating away at the brain part. Now, this happens every day, right? And this is happening all the time if your gut is leaky. The thing is, your brain also has a mechanism of repairing itself. So if your gut is somewhat healthy, then you'll have some degree of repair each night so that your total net damage decreases over time, right? Now, the problem is the kind of dysfunction in the gut that allows for leakiness and allows for anxious thoughts and behaviors are also the kind that prevents the fixing of the brain. So you've got a double whammy here, right? You've got a dysfunctional gut that's driving an inflammatory damage to the brain. That same dysfunctional gut also does not upregulate the brain repair mechanisms that are supposed to happen at night, right? So not only are you damaging the brain, you're not fixing it adequately. So that over time will lead to dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and so on. In the meantime, while that's ongoing long-term, what you're experiencing the damage is you're experiencing anxiety and you're experiencing sleeplessness, you're experiencing brain fog, memory recall issues, right? All of these things are the things that you realize now that are a byproduct of that same pathology. So the leakiness in the gut, the LPS, the inflammation in the brain drives these kinds of behaviors. There's lots of studies that show people with elevated LPS levels, you can use the LPS levels in your blood to predict whether or not they have anxiety and depression. And not only that, you can also predict the severity of their anxiety and depression by how much LPS they have in their system, right? So that endotoxin and the inflammation it causes drives anxious-like behavior. Now, so that's pathology number one. The second pathology is stress response in the body, right? External stressors trigger the flight or fight response in us, which is a very important evolutionary response. It's perfectly fine to be stressed about something, but then come down from it, right? Stress is a normal physiology. And I think it's unfair to people to try to talk about mindfulness work and all these things so that you have no stress in your life, right? That's not reality.
No.
Right? You're going to have stress in your life. And that's
it's going to happen.
It's going to happen. And that's what allowed us to survive through the millions of years of evolution is our flight or fight stress response, right? That's what alerted us to dangers that allowed us to either fight or get away from the danger and allowed us to survive.
Survival.
So, that's a normal thing. The big difference between how our ancestors experienced stress and how we experience stress is that we can't come down from it, right? So the physiological response that occurs in the body when you experience a stressor leads to sympathetic activation. So your sympathetic part of your nervous system, which is trying to upregulate your respiratory rate, increase vasodilation to increase blood flow to your brain and your heart and your muscles. It also upregulates your respiratory rate and your cardiac output. So you're basically getting physically prepared to fight or run away from something, right? Yeah. At the same time, you cannot digest, you cannot break down food, you cannot absorb nutrients. And one of the ways in which the sympathetic nervous system drives blood to your brain and your heart is by increasing inflammation in the brain and the heart, because inflammation is perfusion, right? Right. And the way it increases inflammation is it upregulates, it releases these chemicals called catecholamines that turns on your macrophages and turns on your microglia cells in the brain that drives an inflammatory response in the brain. Now, at the same time, you're also experiencing an increase in cortisol, right? Because cortisol is a key stress hormone. One of the things that cortisol does that's really important is it gets dumped into the gut. Yeah. It goes up high in circulation and then it gets dumped into the gut. One of the reasons it gets dumped in the gut is because there are microbes in the gut that break down cortisol, and then the byproducts of that breakdown go into the kidneys, and that triggers a receptor that upregulates sodium channels from dump more sodium into circulation. And the reason it does that is to increase your blood pressure, right? Because then the blood pressure increase helps you get more perfusion.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
All of this is an acute.
You're just getting ready to fight. You're getting
ready to fight, right?
Yeah.
So you're inflamed. You cannot digest. You cannot repair. You cannot rest. You have perfusion in your brain, perfusion in your heart, and then your gut is also becoming leaky, because one of the side effects of cortisol being dumped into the gut is it increases permeability in the gut. Right. And when you increase permeability in the gut, that drives more inflammation up. And in particular, it drives a very common inflammatory cytokine called IL-6, interleukin 6, right? Now, this one becomes a really key active player, because what IL-6 does when it elevates in its concentration is it goes and it re-triggers the HPA axis again, which causes you to release more cortisol, activate the sympathetic nervous system again, and go through the whole flight or fight response over and over again. And then it causes more cortisol dumping in the gut, makes the gut even more leaky. IL-6 goes up again and re-triggers the HPA axis. So this becomes this vicious loop of a single stressor. Let's say it's driving to work in the morning and somebody cuts you off, or a tweet or an email or something you read in the morning that stressed you out. That single stressor can reactivate your HPA axis and your flight or fight response throughout the entire day for the next 12 to 14 hours.
But wouldn't a normal person, like, I mean, I get that can happen, but typically, like, if you're a reasonably well-adjusted person, don't you get out of that? Don't you kick out of that cycle?
So you kick out of the part of the intensity of the cycle, right?
Yeah.
So here's what happens for somebody with real bad dysbiosis, and here's what happens to your average person who has some level of dysbiosis, because most people have some degree of dysbiosis, right? We found that 55% of healthy, normal individuals, these are people with no conditions, no report, not being managed for anything, they have severe leaky gut as well. So I would say at least half the people in the population have some dysfunction in the gut. So in someone with really bad dysbiosis, a single stressor can manifest a full-on flight or fight response over and over and over again, which then keeps them in that chronic anxiety state for the whole day, right?
Right.
So now you go into something that they call generalized anxiety disorder.
Right.
These are the people that are in an anxious state the entire day. And the reason they're in the anxious state the entire day with no particular reason is because their HPA axis and their flight or fight response is constantly kicking on, right? Now, that's what the people with real dysbiosis, but that accounts for something like 21% of the population, of the adult population, in that state for that long of time. Now, the rest of the population, what tends to happen is you get degrees of HPA activation, right? So one of the other things that's supposed to happen with cortisol is as cortisol levels increase, it acts as its own feedback mechanism, right? Cortisol levels increasing starts to bind things called glucocorticoid receptors. Those glucocorticoid receptors are found in the gut and a bunch of other tissues. As the cortisol binds these glucocorticoid receptors, that becomes a negative feedback signal to turn down the sympathetic nervous system and bring you back down from that flight or fight response. So in those individuals, what tends to happen, in the majority of individuals that have some dysfunction, what tends to happen is you can bind enough of those glucocorticoid receptors during that cortisol spiking. So you start to come down from that major part of the activation. So you no longer feel anxious or nervous. You're back to basal level, but you still are having some level of transient leaky gut. And so you're still getting inflammation that's kicking on. You may not feel it yet, but that inflammation is still kicking on, that IL-6 is going up and irritating that HPA axis. Then what happens is your tolerance level throughout the day goes down, right?
You're more irritable.
What tends to bother you more, more and more are smaller and smaller things.
Right.
Like we've all said, like, as you get older, your tolerance for things goes down, right?
Yeah.
We used to be very tolerant of things. Now, like, the smaller things impact us even more. And especially as they accumulate throughout the day, right? And just think about it, right? When you wake up out of bed, if like you stub your toe in the morning, it's like, it's super frustrating. And then one other thing goes wrong and another thing goes wrong. Now you're having a total bad day. Even though those are all pretty small things when you really think about it, the reason why this accumulates into a bad day is because every time one of those triggers occurs, because you have some degree of leaky gut and inflammation and your HPA axis is triggered to a certain degree, your ability to spike into that flight or fight response becomes more and more and more, right? Your threshold for what
your threshold is lower for getting in there
over time.
All right. So what do we do about it? Because we can't meditate our way out.
You cannot. No, and that's the thing. Like the mindfulness work is good to some degree, but it's not what's going to get you out. It's the physiology that helps get you out, right? And so that's one of the reasons why we developed this psychobiotic. What we found was that certain individuals that had a type of bacteria strain in their gut as a natural inhabitant seemed to be much more resistant to external stressors, had much less cortisol response, did not get reactivation of the HPA axis, did not see all the inflammation that comes from that, and we're able then to rest and sleep properly at night as well. And that strain is a strain we call bifidolongum. In our case, it's a 1714 strain. As it turns out, bifidolongum is a keystone species to begin with. But this unique version of bifidolongum has this exopolysaccharide around it, which is made up of this compound called peptidoglycans. Peptidoglycans are a byproduct of certain types of bacteria, and these peptidoglycans apparently are the key thing in the gut to shut off the inflammatory and leaky gut response of cortisol. So when cortisol gets dumped into the gut, it doesn't allow cortisol to trigger an inflammatory response or trigger leaky gut. It also will bind to receptors on the lining of the gut to send neurotransmitters to the brain to calm down the brain by shifting your brain waves, right? Wow. So we talked about meditative states. One of the benefits, if you know how to meditate, and very few people know how to meditate effectively, is you shift your brain into theta waves. Yeah. Right? Theta waves are that meditative flow state where you're calm, relaxed, your brain works well. And what we found in the clinical trials we published is that when you get exposed to this kind of bacteria, it actually shifts your brain into theta wave mode a little bit more, so that you have more of your brain that's in that calm, relaxed state. It becomes much easier to deal with stressors, right? And you're in a much more rational state. So these psychobiotics, again, speak to the gut-brain connection. And what that tells us is evolutionarily, the individuals that had the healthy, correct microbiome likely survived much better over time than the people who had disrupted microbiome and had a dysfunctional flight or fight response, right? And so the healthiest people were able to propagate these microbes and then pass them along. And that's supposed to be the natural human state. But because we take antibiotics and we kill our microbes in all kinds of crazy ways, we no longer have these microbes in good abundance. And so now it's disrupted our flight or fight response again. And so now, anxiety and all that continues to creep up, right? Because we can't deal with regular stressors. And we can cover COVID a lot more in the next one, but I'll make a quick mention in that, in the beginning, in March of 2020, I had a number of requests to do talks about what is this new pandemic thing that's coming about. And I started talking about it and the type of virus it is and how it infects and what the susceptibilities are and all that. And what was clear even then is that this is a virus that attaches to that ACE2 receptor, right? The ACE2 receptor is a receptor that is expressed on many cells in the body in response to chronic inflammatory damage. And so the ACE2 receptor is part of the repair mechanism of tissue, but it's expressed a lot in individuals that have lots of chronic low-grade inflammation. And the biggest source of that chronic low-grade inflammation is leaky gut. So one of the things I described is that if you take care of your gut, it'll make you more resilient against something like this, because this is what drives that chronic inflammation, that leakiness in the gut. Sure enough, 4 studies published showing that individuals who had low diversity in the gut, intestinal permeability, low levels of keystone species were the ones that had the worst responses to COVID, who had the highest rates of hospitalization and mortality to COVID, directly linked to what their microbiome looked like. And then on top of that, I mentioned IL-6 before. There was a big study called the Boston-Dublin study where they were looking at all these biomarkers in your system to try to figure out which biomarkers drove the highest risks for bad response to COVID. And basically what they found was that people with the highest levels of IL-6, they could predict would more than likely become hospitalized or even be killed from this, right? So the higher your IL-6 levels are, the more susceptible you are to a poor response to it. And, and we can go into how the immune system is connected to this and how the microbiome drives and controls the immune system. But it becomes really important to note that same elevated IL-6 is what's driving all the brain dysfunction, the response to endotoxemia, the presence of endotoxins from leaky gut drives IL-6 up. That's the same thing that's eating away at your brain, like we talked about earlier. So all of these things are all connected to a dysfunctional gut and a leaky gut.
Wow. All comes down to the gut. Okay. So we're gonna have to close this off because I can hear your phone going. People are calling you. It's time for you to go. So if we were going to give people a quick recommendation of a baseline thing that they should all be thinking of doing, I'm thinking the Probiotic is a good place to start. Yeah. But this new, what did you call it? The psychobiotic?
Psychobiotic, yeah.
Psychobiotic sounds like it's going to become another pillar of the foundation of what we all need at some level.
It has to be, unfortunately, right? Because of the state of the world we live in and our bodies and what we're exposed to and all of that. Yeah. And I'm somebody that doesn't, I did at one point in my life experience lots of anxiety and all that, but fortunately I was able to work my way out of that. So I don't really experience stress in any measurable way or anxiety, but I still take it because I know the same mechanism is happening subclinically anyway.
Yeah.
And that inflammation and that, anytime something stresses you out, even if you come down from it pretty quickly, it does elevate your inflammatory responses. And if I don't have that microbe in my system, that inflammatory response is making
it'll perpetuate,
brain, and it'll perpetuate, right? So, I'm sensitive to that even by myself. My kids, you see it in kids, right? Kids these days are unfortunately born with all kinds of dysbiosis.
Oh my gosh.
So you see the behavior disorders that they already have, right? The attention deficit disorders, the lashing out, and all of those things. All of those are anxious responses from the kids, right?
Yeah.
So they're going through this flight or fight response. They just don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah.
Right. So they cry and they lash out and they act, like the crazy little people. And I have two of those little people in my household. So
cute
they're
little
getting
crazy
it
people
all the time. Exactly. And who doesn't want to sleep better, right? Who doesn't want to be in more theta wave? Who doesn't want to have more efficiency with the sleep? And those are all the things we also saw with the psychobiotic. So that's called Zen Biome. And then the megaspores, of course, the spore-based probiotic. So those are two, if you're looking at supplementation, things to think about and consider. Beyond that, the things that won't, are easier things to incorporate, as we talked about, pick up one or two personal care products, start cleaning it up, right? Don't sterilize your home as much as you used to. Be prescriptive about going outside and sit down and have a snack if you can outside. Try to increase the diversity in your diet, as much as you can to the things that you tolerate well. And then nowadays, coming out of the pandemic, one very good thing for you is interacting with people.
Yeah.
I've been out, as you've been out as well. I've been at shows, conferences, hugging hundreds upon hundreds of people and being
it's shocking.
Right? Exactly. And it's very rewarding because that increases oxytocin and reduces stress hormones and reduces inflammation. And then you're also sharing microbes at that time. And then the last recommendation is whoever's listening to this is likely a pretty health conscious individual, right? Because they're investing their time to listen and learn from these programs. That doesn't mean the people in your household are health conscious as well. So it becomes your job to become that anchor in your household, to be that beacon of wellness in your home. So make sure the other people in your home are doing at least some minimal things to improve the overall biome of the home.
Absolutely. Well, and yeah, exactly. And understanding that we're interconnected and what you do is going to affect the next person and vice versa.
Yeah.
Well, Kiran, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. Why don't we tell people where they can find these amazing products? We will have a discount code for you guys. I didn't get it organized before the show, but hopefully it'll be Nat something. And I know there's just thrive.com and I know that as a practitioner, I've used the Microbiome Labs products too.
Yeah, and as a practitioner, you can actually make the products available to your listeners.
Great.
So you'll have an affiliate link that you can post where they can get the products, which is always the best way for me for people to get their products through a practitioner, through somebody they trust, right? So the source is the right source. But if you want to learn more information, come to microbiomelabs with an s.com. Our website, we have lots of blogs and information and videos. Also look me up on social media. On Instagram, I'm Kiran Biome. On Facebook, I think it's just my name, Kiran Krishnan. I post a lot of things, interviews and webinars and all that I do on there. And there's endless amount of information for people to dig into. So reach out there. I also try to engage with people as much as I can to provide them direction.
Amazing.
As they have their questions. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you again so much for your time. I'm going to get on setting up our next one because it'll take us a couple months anyway.
Well,
because you're a busy guy. But thank you so much for your time today. This has been fascinating.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much. We'll chat
Thank
again.
you.
Thanks.